How do you use HTMX with Django's messages framework? We're going to look at that in this video, and we're going to cover 4 main steps in the video. Firstly, we're going to look at how to add messages in a Django view to return a response that contains a one-off message to our users. Then we're going to look at how to add a toast to the page that displays the message to our users, and we're going to style that toast with TailwindCSS. And finally, we're going to use AlpineJS in order to dismiss the toast when this happens, and the toast itself will be shown by using an HTMX Out-of-Band swap. So we're going to cover a mix of Django, HTMX, Alpine and Tailwind CSS in this video. Let's get started. Now we're going to work from this GitHub repository from a previous video. This is the video on updating other content in an HTMX response. So we're going to clone this repository into our local directory using the git clone command. And then once we have that, we're going to cd into that directory, and there we have a Django project that we can use in this video. Now what we're going to do is we're going to base the code off of the final branch, and that's the branch that contains the final code from a previous video. And in order to do that, we can create a new branch using the git checkout-b command, and we're going to call that the same as it is on the repository on GitHub, and that's the branch name of final. And then finally we can use the git pull origin final command, and that will pull all the changes from that branch into your local directory. Once that's done, what I'm going to do is activate a virtual environment using the activate command on Windows, and I'm actually going to open this folder in VS Code. So we have the folder open. What you can do is install the requirements for this project using the pip install command. Once you've done that, what we're going to do is we're going to generate the database for this code, and we can do that with Python manage.py migrate. That will then create the tables and create this SQLite file in the project directory. And when we've done that, what we're going to do is a couple of extra steps to set up. Firstly, I'm going to create a super user, and we'll call the user admin, and we'll just give them a generic password here. Finally, we're going to run the Django development server, and I'm going to go to this application on the browser. So I'm here on the admin panel, and we're going to go to the events model here, and we're going to add a new event to this database. I'm just going to call the event concert number 1, and we'll add the admin user to that event, and we can save this model. And what we can then do is we can go in our application to a new URL, and the urls.py file that's in the core application will tell us the URLs that are available to us. It's this one we want here. It's the event detail page. So it's the event / and then the primary key of the given event. So we're going to go to the browser, and we're going to type /event and /1, and that'll be the primary key of this new event that we've created. And this is the application that we created in a previous video. We can subscribe and unsubscribe to an event, and HTMX is going to dynamically update certain aspects of this page. For example, when we unsubscribe, you see that we don't have any attendees, and we have this message here saying that 0 people are attending, and when we hit subscribe, that changes to 1, and we also get our attendee on the right hand side. It's not the best UI, but we're just demonstrating some concepts here. What we want to do now is add a toast or an alert message when a user subscribes or unsubscribes. For example, if we hit unsubscribe, we want to see some sort of message that displays feedback to the user that confirms that the action has been successful. And this is a good practice when you're developing user interfaces. You want to give feedback to users as much as you can so that they are aware of what's going on and they're more engaged with your websites. Now Django has built in a messages framework, and we're going to go to the documentation here, and as it says, quite commonly in web applications you need to display a one-time notification message, it's also known as a flash message, to the user when you're processing a form or any other kind of input. And Django's messages framework enables you to do these one-time flash messages back to the user when these actions are performed. Now we're going to see how to add a message to our Django response, and to do that I'm going to scroll down a little bit to this section here, and that's using messages in views and templates. And it's these shortcut methods here that I'm going to look at. For example, we have 5 methods on the messages module: debug, info, success, warning and error. So for example, if a user successfully performs an action, you might want to use this method here. It's the messages.success method, and we're going to do that in our application in order to try and show messages when a user is successfully subscribes or unsubscribes. So let's go to views.py in our application, and right at the top of this module we're going to bring in an import, and that's from django.contrib. We're going to import messages, and then we're going to target 2 of our views in the application. This one is the subscribe view, and that is when a user hits subscribe and they're added to an event, and the code to add the given user user to the event is here on line 16. And what we want to do is, before we render out the response, we want to add a messages.success call, and that method success, it will take the request as a first argument, and the second argument is some kind of string that you want the actual message to be. Now for the message, I'm going to create an F string here, and we're going to say you subscribed to event, and then I'm going to reference the event.name. And the event model has this name field allowing you to reference that name. So for example, our event on the page, it's called concert number 1. So we expect the message to be you subscribed to event concert number 1. So that takes care of the subscribe view. We're going to copy that message and I'm going to paste it into the unsubscribe view below here, just above the response. We're going to change the text though to you unsubscribed, and you can also change the word to the word from here, and that will read you unsubscribed from event concert 1. So now we have these messages in our Django view. We need to actually show some kind of alert or toast. So to do that, we're going to go to the documentation for TailwindCSS, and in fact this is the 𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗀 documentation, but it has this section here which I'll link below the video, and you can see these alerts or toasts that are displayed below here. We're going to copy the two here and we're going to move them into a partial template. So what I'm going to do is grab this code here for those top two messages, and let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to go to the templates directory, and within this partials directory I'm going to create a new file, and let's call this file toast.html. And in here we're going to paste in the code from 𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗀, and we're going to change a couple of things to begin with. First of all, I want this to be a little bit bigger, so we're going to change this max width of extra small to just small here, and we'll do that for the error message as well. So that's our setup for these toasts. What we're going to do now is go back to Django's documentation for the messages framework, and we're going to look at this section here on displaying messages. And this is Django template code here. What we're going to do is we're going to reference these variables called messages, and that is the context variable name that is used by default in Django when you add a message to your response. So let's start by copying the if statement, and in this toast.html at the top, we are going to use that if statement to check if there are any messages in the actual response. And at the bottom, we need to end that if statement as well. Now the messages framework adds these messages as a list of messages. So what we're going to do is loop over these with a for loop. So we can say for message in messages. And again, we need to end that for loop in the template, so we can add the end for tag at the bottom here. Now what we're going to do is, if the messages tag is a success tag, in other words, if it's been rendered by the messages.success function, what we're going to do is we're going to show this top toast here. So what we're going to do within this for loop is add another if statement here, and I'm going to tab this all over in a second, but we're going to say if the message.tags is equal to success. In that case, we want to show this particular div here, and that's the success div or the success toast from TailwindCSS. Now, as well as the success div, we also have this danger div as well. So what we're going to do is use an else if statement here, and we're going to check if the message.tags is equal to error. And in that case, what we'll do is we'll show this bottom div, and then of course we need to also end the if statement below that. Now what I'm also going to do is we're going to scroll up to the top here, and I'm going to surround all this content with a div. So for each message in the messages, we're going to create a div that surrounds the particular message, and that could either be a success message or a failure message or an error message here. So under the end if, we can also close off that surrounding div. And there's one last step to this template. Instead of hard coding the text for the given message, what we're going to do is remove that, and we're going to reference the message that we're iterating over in this for loop. So for message and messages, we want to actually render out the messages text, and that text comes from the method that you see in the back end. For example, this text here, we want to see that in the message, so we need to code that message variable, and we'll do that for the failure message as well. So that's our toast.html partial. What we now need to do is go to the subscribe.html page, and this is the base page for this particular application. It's what you see when you go to this page here. So we're now going to include the code for that partial in this base page, and we're going to put that just below this if statement here that looks at the user's events and generates an unsubscribe or a subscribe button. So underneath this end if, I'm going to create a section element, and let's close that off as well. And this has an ID of messages, and within that we're going to use the Django templates include statement, and within this include statement we're going to include that partial that we've just created called toast.html. So let's save all these files, and we're going to go back to our page and refresh this page. Now when we first load this page, we do not see any messages in the response, and actually when we hit subscribe and unsubscribe, we're also not going to see anything by default, and that's because HTMX is not wired up in the response to include these messages. If we go back to our Django views.py file, we have the base event detail page, and that contains no information about messages. This is the view that's used when the page first loads, doesn't need to contain any messages. But if we scroll down to subscribe and unsubscribe, these are views that respond to HTMX requests and they return partials. What we need to do within this partial, for example, is to return the toast partial as well and do an out-of-band swap. So what we're going to do is target this section containing the ID of messages, and we're going to do an out-of-band swap that swaps in the code from toast.html, and this time of course, because we are appending a message to the response with the messages.success function, this toast will then be populated with messages and will therefore render on the page when we hit subscribe or unsubscribe. So I hope that makes sense, but let's demonstrate now by adding an out-of-band swap to our two partials. Now notice there are two partials here. For example, subscribe returns user li.html, whereas unsubscribe will return a different partial. I'm not sure if that's the best practice, but this code was written quite a while ago, so feel free to amend that if you want. But what we're going to do is go to both of these partials. We'll start with user li.html, and we're going to return an out-of-band swap for our toast.html. So what we're going to do is copy this ID here, this section with an ID of messages, and within the user li template, we're going to copy that back in there. And to do an out-of-band swap, we need the hx swap OOB attribute on this, and we can set that equal to true. And then finally we're going to say hx swap equals inner HTML, and within this section what we're going to do of course is include our partial containing the toast, and then we can end the section tag just below that. So let's explain a bit what's going on here. What happens when we return this template as part of an HTMX response is that we're setting a section with the ID of messages, and that has an hx swap out of band set to true as well. So what that's going to do is it's going to find the element with the ID of messages, which is this section here that wraps our toast, and it's going to replace the inner HTML of that element with what we specify within this section tag, and that is by including this toast.html. So the section tag in our parent template, which is this one here, it's going to have its inner HTML replaced by what we specify here. And of course we're specifying the same partial template, but the difference is when we return this response, the messages are going to be populated and are going to show on the page. So this is the way HTMX does out-of-band swaps. If you specify this attribute here, it will then use the ID on the element to find what should be replaced, and it will use whatever swap mechanism you specify with this attribute in order to swap in the new content. So let's copy this section and we're going to add it to the other template that we're using in this response, because we want to perform the same out-of-band swap and show the toast whenever a subscribe or an unsubscribe event happens. We can then save these files and go back to our page here. Now when we hit subscribe, what's going to happen is you see this toast appearing below the button that says you've subscribed to the event concert 1. And when we hit unsubscribe, you can see the other message appearing from the unsubscribe view in the Django application. And this one says you've unsubscribed from the concert. And you can toggle through these as much as you want and you get the correct toast displayed below. Now let's say we wanted this toast to appear at the top right of our page or somewhere that's not in the main flow of the application. What I'm going to do is go back to the Tailwind documentation here for this page, and again I'll link this below the video. Now there's a section on the right hand side for positioning. Let's click that and we can go down and we can use the fixed class from Tailwind to position these toast elements relative to the main content wrapper element from your document. So if we want this to appear at the top right of the page, we can copy these classes here, and let's go back to our VS Code partial for the toast.html, and to these divs that contain the toast content we can add those classes fixed, top 5 and right 5, and we can do the same for the error toast below here. We can just add those to that toast, and then we can go back to our page, and this time when we hit subscribe you can see that this appears at the top right of the application, and when we hit unsubscribe we get the same unsubscribe toast appearing at the top right. Now I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so you can see it more clearly. So let's try changing the width from small to medium, and we'll do the same for the other toast above. This is duplication of code. It's not ideal, so you might want to factor these out into a partial that can take some context rather than duplicating the code. And let's also make the text larger for the message itself, and this is the message here. It's got a text small element. Let's make that text large, and again same for below. If we save these and go back to our page, when we now refresh this page and hit subscribe, you can see the event is a little bit bigger at the top right, and that's because the text is larger. Now there is one problem at the moment. It looks like we have code that can dismiss the toast, but that doesn't actually work. Now the 𝗵𝗽𝗽𝘁𝗲𝗿𝘀 toast element should dismiss when you click this cross here. If we go to the documentation, we can see an example of that when we click the cross, but it's not working on a dynamic response that's returned as a partial and swapped into the DOM. It only works for me on page load. If you know why this is, please let me know in the comments. But what I'm actually going to do to fix this is use AlpineJS, not just for this, but I'm going to show something quite cool in a second with Alpine as well. So what we're going to do is go to the Alpine installation documentation, and we're going to copy the CDN link here, and we're going to paste that into base.html, and I'll link this page in the description of the video. Let's go back now to base.html. I'm going to close these open editors and we'll load up base.html, and just below Tailwind here I'm going to paste the script to load up AlpineJS, and then we can go back to toast.html. We have a div wrapping all of these elements. I'm going to make this an Alpine component, and we can do that using the xData attribute, and that's set to a JavaScript object, and we're going to use one key here, and that's dismissed, and we're going to initially set that to false. And what we want to do is when we click the cross at the top right here, we want to set dismissed to true and then hide the element. So in order to do that, we also need to add an xShow attribute, and we only want to show this when dismissed is equal to false. Therefore, we're going to use this syntax here, the negation operator and dismissed, and this means we will show the surrounding elements when dismissed is equal to false. Otherwise, when it's true, we are not going to show that. We're going to hide the surrounding elements. And the final thing we need to do is the button here that contains our cross. We need to add a click event to that button. So what I'm going to do is use this syntax here to add a click event, and then in that click event what we're going to do is set dismissed equal to true, and we can copy that click event again down to this button here below, setting dismissed to true when we click that button, and this should therefore set this variable to true, and therefore the xShow will evaluate to false and the content for the toast will not be shown on the page. So let's see now if this works. If we go back to our page here, we're going to click subscribe, and you can see we get the message at the top right. If we hit the cross, you see that it now disappears, and when we hit unsubscribe, we get the opposite message. Again, we can dismiss that using this cross. So now we have a system that works in AlpineJS. So that's quite beneficial if you're returning a lot of dynamic content and anything strange is going on with these events. You can use Alpine to control the DOM using just a little bit of state in your application in order to show and hide things and perform all sorts of other actions too. Now there's a few other very small things to show in this video. We're going to go back to views.py, and I'm just going to demonstrate a different function you can use on the messages object. For the subscribe event, we're using messages.success, and when we unsubscribe, we're also using messages.success. What we can do is, imagine we wanted to show an error message. We can also use the messages.error function, and what that will do is to the particular message that's being returned here, it's going to add a tag of error. And if we go back to our toast.html, you can see if we scroll down to this here, this is the toast danger that we're not seeing on the page so far, because this one is only shown if the messages tag is equal to error. We're now going to see that in our unsubscribe event, and that's because we've changed the function on the back end from messages.success to messages.error. So let's save all of these files and go back to our page. When we hit subscribe, we still get the same event at the top right here. When we unsubscribe though, we get a different icon shown here, and this one comes from our other toast that contains the ID of toast danger, and the SVG element that's shown for that particular toast, it's a different icon than the one we got with the other toast. So we're coming to the end of this video now. Let's go back to the page. I want to show one last thing in this video, and that's how to dismiss the toast after a number of seconds have elapsed. For example, if we hit subscribe here, we see the toast, but you might also want to add some interactivity to this toast where it disappears after, let's say, 2 seconds. So the toast will appear on the page, and then after 2 seconds it's going to disappear without the user having to click this dismiss button. Now it turns out we can achieve this this with AlpineJS. So let's go back to the Alpine documentation. And at the left hand side here we have a directives section, and one of the directives is x-init. So we're going to click that and be taken to that page. And this directive allows you to hook into the initialization phase of any element in Alpine. So for example, when we initialize an Alpine component, we can execute a function that will perform some sort of logic when that component is initialized. And we're going to use that in our toast.html partial. We have the div that contains the xData attribute at the top here. This is the root element for our Alpine component, but we're also going to add another Alpine directive, and that's the x-init directive. And that can be set to any logic, as I was saying, that you want. So for example, what we want to do is set a timeout here and perform a callback function after a given amount of time. Now what we want to do is we want to change this variable here in our state. We want to change dismissed from false to true after 2 seconds, and we can do this with the setTimeout function. So let's create a callback function within here, and what we're going to do is simply in the body of that function set dismissed equal to true. So it's a very simple callback function. It just changes the state of one of our variables in the Alpine component, and the second parameter to set timeout is the number of milliseconds that you want this callback function to fire after. In our case, we want to do 2000 milliseconds, that's 2 seconds, and that will hopefully have the effect of dismissing the alert message after 2 seconds on our page. So let's save this file and we can go back to the browser. And now when we hit unsubscribe here, we get the alert at the top right, but you can see after 2 seconds it disappears, and it does this without the user clicking the cross. So this is being performed by the x-init callback function, and it's being done after 2 seconds. And we can see that for the other event as well. When we subscribe to an event, you can see the message and then it disappears after 2 seconds. And you can change the number of seconds to anything you want. For example, if you want to dismiss after 500 milliseconds or half a second, you can do that and then go back to the page. If you refresh the page and hit unsubscribe, you see that it disappears very quickly in this case. So you can play with the period of time that you want to dismiss these events, and this is just a cool technique in AlpineJS. You can run any kind of function or logic when you initialize a component using the x-init directive. So that's all for this video. In this one we've learned how to integrate HTMX with Django's messages framework, and we've learned how to create a partial that contains the code for our toast styled up with TailwindCSS, and we can then include that toast as an out-of-band swap whenever we're returning content that might have messages associated with it. And finally, we've also learned how to use AlpineJS to add a little bit of extra interactivity to our page when a user performs certain actions or after an elapsed period of time. So thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.